14 minutes. That's all they got. The Titanic took almost 3 hours to sink. This ship took 14 minutes. Long enough to wake in the dark, feel the floor roll beneath you, and watch the hallway you just walked down become a wall above your head. On a fog-covered river in Canada, more than 1,000 people drowned that night. More paying passengers than the Titanic ever lost. And then the world forgot them. Because that same summer, it went to war. This is the Empress of Ireland. She sank faster than the Titanic. She drowned more of her passengers than the Titanic. And then she slipped almost completely out of history. To understand how a modern ocean liner could be gone in 14 minutes, you have to go back to a quiet dock in Quebec. The Empress of Ireland was the pride of the Canadian Pacific Fleet. 550 feet of steel, built to carry mail and passengers across the North Atlantic, between Quebec and Liverpool. On the night of the 28th of May, 1914, she left Quebec City on that familiar run. On board were 1,477 people. Emigrants going home. Families. 138 children. And a delegation of around 170 members of the Salvation Army, bound for a great congress in London. Her route ran down the St. Lawrence River toward the open sea. It was a passage her officers had made countless times. The night was clear and cold. And somewhere ahead in the dark, a second ship was coming the other way. That ship was the Storstad. A Norwegian collier, heavy with 11,000 tons of coal, headed upriver toward Montreal. The two vessels were closing on each other near Pointe-au-Père, off the town of Rimouski. Each could see the other's lights. There was time. There was room. And then, between them, a bank of fog rolled in off the water. At about 1:38 in the morning, the Empress's crew saw the masthead light of the Storstad, a few miles off. Captain Henry Kendall ordered his engine slowed, then stopped, and sounded 3 long blasts, telling the other ship he was holding still. But the fog was thickening fast. Within minutes, it swallowed both ships whole. And in that blindness, something went wrong. To this day, no one fully agrees on what happened inside the fog. Each ship believed the other had changed course. Whistles called back and forth through the gray, trying to fix a position that kept slipping away. Kendall stared into the murk for the lights he had just seen. When they finally reappeared, they were not where they should have been. They were close. Far too close. And they were pointed straight at his side. At around 1:55, the Storstad came out of the fog bow first. Her hull had been strengthened for pushing through river ice, and that reinforced bow drove deep into the Empress's starboard side, almost exactly amidships, between her two funnels. For a moment, the two ships were locked together. Then the current pulled them apart. And that was the worst thing that could have happened. As long as the Storstad's bow stayed buried in the wound, it plugged it. The moment it slid free, it left a hole in the Empress roughly the size of a small house. Somewhere around 350 square feet, torn open below the waterline. Through it, the St. Lawrence poured in at an almost unimaginable rate. Roughly 60,000 gallons every second. More than 250,000 liters, second after second, into the heart of the ship. The Empress had watertight compartments, just like the Titanic. On paper, she should have stayed afloat long enough to save everyone. 3 things made sure she would not. First, the water came in so violently that she began to list to starboard within seconds. Second, her watertight doors had to be closed by hand, and there was no time, and no light, to do it. And third, on that warm spring crossing, many of the lower portholes had been left open for air. As she leaned over, those open portholes dropped below the surface, and the river poured straight in through them. Almost at once, the lights went out. Deep inside the hull, hundreds of passengers woke in total darkness, in cabins that were already tilting under their feet. The corridors they knew were now black, and flooding, and standing on their sides. For most of the people down there, the way out had disappeared in the first 2 minutes. Up on deck, the crew fought to launch the lifeboats. But the list was already too steep. On the high port side, the boats swung inward over the deck and could not be lowered at all. On the low starboard side, the boats were already dipping into the river. Of more than 40 lifeboats, only a handful ever got away. The sea was taking the ship faster than any drill had ever imagined. About 10 minutes after the collision, the Empress gave up the fight. She rolled all the way onto her starboard side and lay there, half out of the water, like a great wounded animal. And in that strange, brief pause, hundreds of people simply climbed out. Through portholes, up stairways, out onto the cold wet steel of the hull, which was now facing the sky. As many as 700 people found themselves standing on the side of their own ship. It did not last. With a shudder, the bow slipped under, the stern lifted, and the Empress of Ireland slid completely beneath the river. 14 minutes had passed since the Storstad struck her. 14 minutes. And the hundreds of people who had crawled onto her hull were suddenly in the water, in the dark, in a river cold enough to kill. Set it against the clock, and the speed of it is hard to take in. 1:38, the lights of the Storstad. Around 1:47, the fog closes in. About 1:55, the collision. Within 2 minutes, the lights fail and she lists hard over. Around 10 minutes in, she rolls onto her side. And by roughly 2:10 in the morning, she is gone. From a calm, ordinary night to more than 1,000 dead, in barely a quarter of an hour. The Storstad, crushed at the bow but still afloat, lowered her own boats into the dark and began pulling people from the water. Other ships raced to the scene. But the St. Lawrence and Lake May is barely above freezing, and many who had lived through the sinking did not live through the swim. Rescuers found the living and the dead tangled together in the debris, in a silence broken only by cries fading, one by one, into the fog. Captain Henry Kendall had been on the bridge when the Storstad hit. As his ship rolled, he was thrown from the bridge into the river. He caught hold of a floating wooden grating and clung to it until a lifeboat reached him. And then, soaked and half frozen, he climbed in and took command of the rescue, going back again and again for his passengers. He survived. He would carry that night with him for the rest of his life. The heaviest loss fell on the Salvation Army. Of the roughly 170 members traveling to their London Congress, only a couple of dozen lived. Survivors told the same story again and again. In the water, Salvationists were seen giving their own lifebelts to strangers, and slipping under so that someone else might float. Their staff band, the pride of the movement, was almost entirely lost. Among the dead were the actor Lawrence Irving and his wife Mabel, last seen together as the ship went down. But the cruelest number of that night belongs to the children. Of the 138 children aboard the Empress of Ireland, only 4 survived. 4. When the count was finally made, it was staggering. Of the 1,477 people aboard, 1,012 were dead. Only 465 came home. More than 2 out of every 3 people on that ship. And here is the fact that should have made the Empress of Ireland unforgettable. She took more paying passengers to the bottom than the Titanic did. Titanic is the more famous disaster, and more people died on her in total, because she carried a far larger crew. But of ordinary passengers, the men, women and children who simply bought a ticket, more were lost on the Empress. It was the worst peacetime maritime disaster in Canadian history. And almost no one has heard of it. There were 2 inquiries, and they never agreed. The Canadian inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, the same man who had judged the Titanic, laid the blame on the Storstad for changing course in the fog. A separate Norwegian inquiry cleared the Storstad completely, and blamed the Empress. More than a century later, the two verdicts still cannot be reconciled. The fog kept its secret. So why did the world forget? Timing. Just 9 weeks after the Empress went down, an assassination in Sarajevo lit the fuse of the First World War. A single peacetime shipwreck, however terrible, vanished beneath 4 years of slaughter. And a year later, when the Lusitania was torpedoed, she took the headlines the Empress never got. The Empress of Ireland became a footnote. A disaster the size of the Titanic, quietly erased by history. Not every story from that night ended in the water. 7-year-old Grace Hannigan was traveling with her mother and her father, a Salvation Army bandmaster. When the ship rolled over, all three were thrown into the river. Grace was pulled into a lifeboat. Her parents were not. She would live another 81 years, the last living survivor of the Empress of Ireland, carrying the memory of a night she had been far too young to understand. The wreck did not stay a secret forever. In 1964, divers found her again, lying on her side in the cold green dark. She has drawn explorers ever since, and she has taken some of them, too. The current is fierce, the water near freezing, the visibility poor. Over the years, the Empress has claimed the lives of divers who came to see her, adding new names to a list that already ran too long. So she is still there. The Empress of Ireland lies on her starboard side in about 40 meters of water, a few kilometers off Pointe-au-Père. In the weeks after the sinking, divers went down into the wreck to recover the mail, the silver from her strongroom, and as many of the dead as they could reach. In 1998, Quebec made her a protected historic site. A memorial stands above a mass grave at Rimouski, carved with the names of the lost. 1,012 people. 14 minutes. A calm river, and a bank of fog. Remember the Empress of Ireland, so that the ones who went down with her are not forgotten twice.